see things that the climate scientists of 20 years ago were not predicting would occur so soon.
First, people deny there's a problem. Then they deny that there's a solution. Then they tell you that it's too expensive.
It is a battle to prevent powerful people from spoiling the environment.
Anybody who doesn't understand this is not paying attention to the data.
The assertion that global warming is occurring, it's really a hoax.
How dumb could you be?
We do have a clock in front of us.
Coal contributes to 4 out of the 5 leading causes of death in the United States.
There was actually 6 neighbors who had brain tumors in about a 10-house span.
In countries with a heavy reliance on natural resources, you can see lagging development, high levels of inequality, massive corruption.
When we talk about feeding the world, we have to ask, feeding the world what?
There are literally billions of animals being raised for food. It's pretty shocking when you think of the vast destruction of the forest.
Everything that walked, grew, or flew is annihilated.
What's more criminal than anything else is that we have alternatives that are available today.
This is a crisis, but it's a huge opportunity because we can shift the way we live.
Phenomenal things are happening.
There's a whole series of changes in the way cars are being built.
Solar and wind. That's going to be our primary source of energy.
People who eat heavily plant-based diets have lower rates of obesity, lower rates of cancer.
What is required is an integrated effort. This is a gigantic struggle for the future of the world.
Charles, thank you so much for being here.
You people are not enthusiastic enough.
Charles, I remember when your first documentary was released, No End in Sight, there was a lot of discussion about how you were a sort of former Republican who was dismayed with the Bush administration, and you made this documentary. I mean, granted, I would say one of the most iconic, powerful documentaries we got about the Iraq War, and then you made Inside Job, and now you're making Time to Choose, which I think you've made Time to Choose. I think, again, someone would say, wrongly, a mouthpiece for a liberal cause, but I think that your background shows that these 3 movies that you've made, these 3, quote, causes, are bipartisan.
I certainly hope so. Not because I'm a Republican, by the way. There's no need to be so cruelly insulting, sir.
Did I bring up some dark times? I'm sorry.
What was true is that before 9/11, before obviously the invasion of Iraq, I had been in favor of using military force to remove Saddam Hussein, basically for kind of humanitarian intervention reasons because the people of Iraq were suffering under the sanctions. Obviously, I didn't have in mind what the Bush administration later did.
But I guess what I'm trying to speak to is the idea that these causes, you've made an amazing documentary about climate change and about how we can affect climate change and not necessarily, stop it in its tracks, but really affect change and stop a lot of the causes that have come from climate change. Yet, like the war in Iraq, like the financial industry in your last documentary, these have become bipartisan issues unnecessarily. It's almost like a conversation where if you say, I want to do something for climate change, and I want to talk about electricity, and I want to talk about food, you're suddenly speaking from a leftist mouthpiece, which I don't think should be the case. How do you approach making a documentary like this in the hopes that it will go across party lines?
Well, I do my best. It certainly, despite my beautiful youthful looks, I'm actually an old guy, and by which I really mean I was a political scientist when there were still reasonable people in the Republican Party. I actually had friends, and I actually worked for people in the White House in Republican administrations when I was a graduate student in political science at MIT. And the Republican Party has, of course, changed a lot. But I do try to make my films in a way that is completely nonpartisan, and more than nonpartisan, I try and make them in a way that's non-political. I try and make films about policy issues, about humanitarian issues, and to talk about them in a way that isn't affected by and isn't related to partisan or electoral politics. So I do my best.
So what was your approach, and why did you approach the subjects in Time to Choose?
Well, about 2.5 years ago, I guess, I essentially by chance ran into a man who lives in Berkeley, California, where I live part-time, and who told me that climate change was a solvable problem. And like many people, at least of my generation, I had seen An Inconvenient Truth when that film came out 10 years ago, the first serious film to talk about climate change as a problem, but it didn't leave you with much optimism with regard to how to solve it. And I hadn't paid much attention, but I received an education a couple of years ago about the fact that not only was this problem solvable, but if we took it seriously and if we addressed it seriously, that the world would end up being a better place, a more prosperous place, a healthier place. And that struck me as something worth making a movie about.
I also think what's so wonderful about your film is that it's not just that it's solvable. I think after Inconvenient Truth, people felt like it was solvable, but the only way for it to be solvable was to completely disrupt our lives in a way that was nobody could really wrap their head around, so you might as well just become a nihilist about the Earth, it seemed. Where with your film, there is this element of it's solvable, we're working towards it. What you need to do is just pay attention a little bit more. All of these things are there for you to be a part of the solution. Why was that part important for you to sort of impart to the audience?
Well, it was important for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's a global problem, and climate change and addressing climate change means something very, very different if you're in rural Kenya than it does if you're in Indonesia or Brazil or the United States. And I wanted to make a global film about a global problem. So I felt that it was important to address how people actually live, including how we live in a wealthy, urban, developed nation. And then at a personal level, you know, I love cities. I think cities are beautiful. So, you know, what we're going to lose if we don't address the climate problem is not just nature. We'll lose nature, and that'll be terrible. But we'll also lose half of the world's biggest cities, which are on coastlines, and those include some of the most beautiful places in the world, places that I have lived in or visited. And you know, if we lose Venice and Rio de Janeiro and New York and Los Angeles, San Francisco, where I was born, that'll be a huge tragedy for the world's culture as well as for our standard of living. And I wanted to make the point that that wasn't necessary, that we could continue living urban, developed, complicated, cultured lives in places like this, and still do that while dealing with this problem.
You break the film into 3 sections, right? You have electricity, right? Energy and electricity.
Coal and electricity.
Coal and electricity,
Yeah.
excuse me.
Oil and cars.
Oil and cars, and land and food.
Yes.
Right? How did you come to break it up into those 3 sections?
Well, it took.
Thank you for helping me with that as well.
Well, it's complicated. So we actually had a completely different structure at the beginning, and the original structure that we had, and which we showed people as a rough cut of the film, was we had the whole problem followed by the whole solution, and we showed that to a couple of dozen people, and they said, you know, look, we can't even get all the way through the film. If you show us this 45 minutes of devastation, we're going to slit our throats before the film's even over. So they said, you know, it's too much to lay that on people before you give them any hint of there being hope. And so we tried several other structures, one of which was geography, different countries. And then the final one that seemed to work the best was by, kind of technology and problem area. And that does seem to work. That does seem to work.
What section do you find that you personally, and then on top of that, most people are most affected by, or the people that we're talking to right now?
That's hard to say, but I'll certainly say that the experience that I had, I was in there, doing that filming for almost everything that's in the film. There were a couple of places that I couldn't go because I would stick out as somebody who obviously didn't belong. And we had to do a lot of covert and illegal filming in a number of countries, in China, in Indonesia, and Nigeria. But I was in most of those places, and I will never, for the rest of my life, forget being in that small plane overflying those fires in Indonesia. People in the environmental movement had told me about burning season in Indonesia, and they told me that it's really bad and really extreme, and you've never seen anything like it, but nothing prepared me for the reality of that. We couldn't even get into the area for 5 days because all the airports in the region were closed because the smoke was so dense that no plane could take off or land. And when we were finally allowed to fly in, it was in circumstances where I guarantee you no airplane would have been allowed to take off or land in the United States. Visibility was maybe a quarter of a mile, and it was the smoke from these fires. And then in that plane, I was in that plane for 4 hours, and flying over that and seeing that for 4 hours, it was a horrifying, chilling experience. And unless we do something about that country, in another decade, Indonesia is going to be gone.
And burning season is it's deforestation to a degree, isn't it?
Yes.
To set up new palm oil plantations.
Yes. Basically, what happens is it's over 2/3 of it is illegal and permitted only through corruption. And so what they do first is they log the place. They take all the valuable timber out. And once they've done that, the cheapest, fastest way to prepare the ground for a palm oil plantation is just to burn everything down. And that's what they do.
And you say, if we don't stop this in a number of years, I think you said 10, 15 years, Indonesia will not exist. And I think so often people say something along the lines of like, well, that's Indonesia, that doesn't have anything to do with me. But so often, and we've found recently, there's been a lot of documentation that migrancies and wars are starting to be fought even more, and people are moving even more because of a lot of the effects of global warming.
That's true, and there are many reasons that we should care about Indonesia and, of course, other countries that are affected by this problem. Indonesia is a beautiful, beautiful country, and the amount of natural beauty there that we'll lose, the underwater scenes in the film, the underwater filming, that was in Indonesia also, and Indonesia has some of the most beautiful coral reefs in the entire world. And everybody knows that who is involved with diving and the water, and it'll all be gone. It'll all be gone. And it's also a country that has a population of almost 250 million people, and it still is a very poor country, and those people are not going to have a chance to develop and grow unless Indonesia has an economy that's based on education and technology and learning instead of on burning down forests.
You mentioned China, and there's this incredible footage in the documentary of these mines in China and how unsafe these mines are. How did you come across that footage?
Being sneaky. We did a lot of research, and the research told me that coal mining in China was a really horrifying industry. I was quite shocked. I had no idea that coal mining over the last 30 years in China had killed 1 million people. 1 million people is a lot of people. And that's coal mining. That's not the air pollution. The air pollution shortens the lifespan of Chinese by years and causes hundreds of thousands of excess deaths every year. But that's the air pollution. But just mining coal has killed over 1 million people. and injured many more. It's crippled or injured probably another 5 million. So I determined that, I decided we have to capture that somehow. And so we got Chinese cinematographers and Chinese film crews, and using some secrecy and some bribery and some connections, we were able to get access to the mines and also to coal miners who had suffered from black lung disease.
And the access to the mine, was that your footage? That wasn't your footage that was inside the mine when it was the last moments of the guy in the mine, was it?
That footage was taken by one of our cinematographers shortly before I contacted him to make this film, and the rest of the footage was taken by him working for us.
Wow, that's unbelievable. Now I have to ask, one of the things that I felt, and I kind of brought this up at the top of us talking while watching the film, is that there are all of these lobbying powers that are for all of these elements of energy, of all these sort of resources that are hurting the environment, that are contributing to global warming. But where at one time it seemed like it was the lobbyists pushing their agenda through certain politicians, it now feels to me like we've almost sort of tiptoed over here to this place where politicians actually believe and people actually believe that global warming isn't true for some reason. Do you get a sense of that with politicians, or does it just feel like still that they're in the pocket of lobbyists?
I think it's a mixture of both.
I mean, like Ted Cruz, for example, who was just so, at a certain point you watch that and you think to yourself, is this guy just a phenomenal liar, or does he just truly believe this?
Well, in his case, possibly both. He certainly is a phenomenal liar, and he might also believe this. You never know in these circumstances. It's of course it's in these people's financial and also emotional self-interest to believe the stuff that they're saying, and that's to their advantage to say. But I think that the good news in this is that although there is this very hard core of people who don't believe climate change exists or profess not to believe it, that they are a declining minority, both in the United States and in the rest of the world. And there are many reasons for that, and one reason, I think, is just that now the reality of climate change is so in front of us, in front of our eyes. I'm from California. I was born and raised in California, and if you're from California and you've spent several decades there, you don't need a scientist to tell you that climate change is real. You see it. Spring comes a month earlier than it used to come. Summers are hotter. There's much less rain. And you see all these droughts and wildfires as a result. So, you don't, if you have lived in the state of California for the last 30 years, it's really hard not to believe that climate change is real.
Would you say a declining minority, but possibly louder than the majority a lot of times in this country?
Yes, when you have a minority that believes something really, really strongly and that has a lot of money, that's a dangerous state of affairs. And we'll see how important that is this November when we find out whether we have President Trump or not. Not a partisan statement or even a political statement, just a humanitarian statement. If we get Donald Trump as the president of this country, then our planet is in danger.
Absolutely. Has anyone, to be cheeky for a second, has anyone pointed out the irony of Oscar Isaac narrating this while also portraying Apocalypse in the current X-Men movie right now?
It has been mentioned.
I could not help it while I was watching them. I haven't actually seen the X-Men movie, but I couldn't help but thinking, like, oh, this is funny, coming out at the same time as him portraying this character Apocalypse in this movie.
Yes, and apparently there's some sensitivity in Hollywood land about that fact. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Let's turn it over to the audience for some questions. First question.
Hi, it's an honor you sitting in front of me right now. I'm really excited. I can ask you 10,000 questions because this topic really interests me as far as a young woman in this generation seeing everything change the way that it is. How would you translate this to like the younger generations because of the ignorance of what is actually going on? How would you speak it in their language?
Well, that's actually a very good and very serious question. And one thing that in a purely selfish way worries me a little bit is that young people don't watch as many movies as they used to, and as we used to. And one thing that we may end up doing, and I may end up doing, is making a series of shorter films that can be on the web. And I've also thought, and I might do this, there are some aspects of this that just don't really fit in a movie, but we have an enormous amount of footage, some of which is very striking and very beautiful. And so I might actually try making a piece of video art about this. I'm talking with some people about this now.
Incredible footage, the stuff that you have in this film. Was a lot of it, I mean, you said that you were flying over with a small plane, but was a lot of it drone footage too? It's all really beautiful, all the aerial shots.
We used drones and small planes and helicopters. Yeah, lots of them.
I hesitate to ask too many questions about the details of stuff that's in the film because I don't want to not necessarily not give anything away, but I want to leave stuff for people to see in the film. But the land and food section of the movie is so fascinating, and I think something that people don't really think about when they think about eating better meat or just eating better quality foods. They think all the time about their diet, not realizing that when you eat something that isn't filled with hormones or isn't filled with antibacterial stuff that is put in meats, that you're actually just doing something better for the environment, not just your diet. You're being more socially conscious.
Yes, that was a big discovery for me. I've actually been mostly a vegetarian for a fairly long time, for various reasons, but the impact of the way we eat on the environment and also on our health, the significance of that, it changed my diet, and actually it changed the diet of almost everybody who worked on the film. It was very interesting to see that. The editors, our sound people, our cinematographers, when they saw these things that they'd never seen before, when they learned these things, it really had an impact on them, a huge impact. That, another experience was that will remain with me forever was flying over that feedlot. In the film, there's this gigantic feedlot where there's enormous numbers of cows being raised in this industrial way, living, by the way, in their own waste, having to live in a very unhappy way, being fed in a very industrial way. And just to see the magnitude of that and its impact on the animals, that will remain with me as well. But also, for this you have to look to the science and you have to read things. You can't really convey it visually. But the impact on human health, we really will have much healthier, longer lives if we eat in a healthy way. And I've become now, I'm the most incredibly disgusting, unpleasant, organic fascist about the food that I eat. I've really become, completely unrepentantly against industrial food.
And it's not, again, I think we talk about diet, we talk about eating healthy, and people think vegetarian, they think vegan. It's not just that. You can be a meat eater and still eat organically, still eat socially, eat consciously,
Yes, that is true. If meat is raised in a very natural way on grasslands, then there's a decent environmental argument for being able to eat at least some amount of meat.
Not as much as we eat currently.
But not as much as we eat now. The average for Americans is 9 ounces per person per day. And that's way, way too much. And it's way too much, not just for the planet, but for our own health. It's not good for you. It really is not good for you. And the evidence about that is very clear.
Next question.
Hey, Charles. Thanks for being here and saying what needs to be said. What are some volunteer organizations that you'd recommend to help people change the world for the better? Because after hearing you talk, I definitely want to be more involved than I currently am.
As you can imagine, in the course of making this film, I had a lot of contact with the environmental world, the environmental organizations that work on these issues. And I have to say that I came away enormously impressed with them, especially with some of them. And I would say that the two that impressed me the most are the Sierra Club, which works exclusively in the United States, and Greenpeace, which is global. I was very, very impressed with what Greenpeace is doing, not just in its world headquarters, which is in Amsterdam, but in the several national organizations that I dealt with, which were the United States, Germany, Brazil, and interestingly, China. Greenpeace in China has a large organization, and despite the fact that it's extremely difficult for foreign NGOs to operate in China at all, especially with the new Chinese premier, Xi, who's quite repressive in many ways, Greenpeace is still able to operate in a very effective way, and the quality of the people that they have is extremely high. So I would totally endorse the idea of your becoming involved in some of these organizations.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, I was wondering if there's a news source that you trust to get environmental news.
I would say there's no one source. There are several. In most regards, the environmental coverage of the New York Times is quite good. Climate change is an exception. I would not give the New York Times very high marks with regard to climate change. They're improving, but they're still not where they ought to be. And I'm not quite sure why. I don't know the individual people involved. So, don't just read the New York Times. There are several very good climate blogs. There's one which is run by the Center for American Progress, and I've forgotten the man's name, and he gave me an interview, and so he'll shoot me that I've forgotten his name. But if you look up the climate blog from the Center for American Progress, they do good work. The Sierra Club's publications, Greenpeace's publications. And then, interestingly, I do have to say that there isn't any one place that is comprehensive with regard to information about climate change and solutions to climate change. And, I think that if somebody created one, that would be a good business, actually. There's a very good one about deforestation, especially in Asia, called Manga Bay. It's mainly about Indonesia and that region. And if you're interested in that subject, Manga Bay is a very good place to go. But it's much more fragmented than it should be.
Quick question before I let you go. I rarely ask people what they're doing next because it feels like it's kind of a hackneyed question, but coming from a documentary about the military-industrial complex to corrupt banking, which is actually just corrupt economies across the world, including our own, and now climate change, three of the biggest topics that I think you can cover. What are you thinking you could possibly cover next that would be as vast and as encompassing as those three stories?
Well, I don't know yet. I'm working on several things right now. One thing that I might do is I might take a break from serious global political issues and make a thriller, a shameless entertainment.
That sounds great.
I have wasted a very significant fraction of my life reading and watching trash. And
wait, hold on.
And I would love to make a piece of classy trash.
And now I'm going to hold you just for a couple minutes longer. I'm sorry, because I want to know what your top 3 classy trash movies are. That Charles Ferguson, director of Time to Choose, No End in Sight, and Inside Job's favorite trashy movies.
It's a very long list. I mean, it ranges from The Avengers, the 1960s television series, to Chinatown, to LA Confidential, The Maltese Falcon, The Big Sleep.
Waiting for the Trash.
Good point. Those
Charles.
are works of literature.
Charles, when can people see Time to Choose?
Starting tomorrow in New York City and a week later in places around the country.
Awesome. Charles, thank you so much for being here.